Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series. Today we have among us Dr. Arian Sharifi. He is the former Director of National Stress Assessment, Office of the National Security Council, Afghanistan, and he is currently the Senior Advisor to Afghanistan's Foreign Minister and holds a Ph.D. in International Security Studies from Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show.
Awesome. Hello, Siddhant and Ratnadeep. Greetings to you and to your viewers, and thank you very much for providing the opportunity to be here for a few minutes and share some thoughts with you.
Thank you,
I would like to make two quick disclaimers in the beginning. Number one is that I'm here at my personal capacity, and the views that I share are strictly mine. They do not represent the views of any organization that I've been with in the past or am with at present.
I'll go. So before we start, sir, I wanted a quick introduction about the nature of the job that you have done, being the Director of National Threat Assessment in the Office of National Security Council, because very less is known about the intelligence apparatus of Afghanistan and the national security apparatus of Afghanistan. So tell me, what was your role as the Director General of Threat Assessment in the Office of National Security Council?
Thank you. Well, as you know, the Office of the National Security Council in Afghanistan, as it is pretty much elsewhere in the world, works at the strategic level within the national security apparatus. Obviously, it changes slightly from administration to administration, but overall, the functions remain the same. I was responsible for the Directorate of National Threat Assessment, and so the primary objective, the primary function that my department had was to assess the national level strategic threats to Afghanistan's national interest. We produced 4 strategic documents each year, in fact, updated each year. The first one I was solely responsible for was the National Threat Assessment document. And the second one, based on the threat assessment, then comes the national security policy. Based on that, then comes the national security strategy. So 3 of those, my department, along with other colleagues across the government of Afghanistan, were responsible for writing up and for it on an annual basis. Those were sort of the main documents we produced, but at the same time, on a daily basis, pretty much most of the strategic level security and intelligence reports that come from various departments to the president's office, it would come through us. We would put the final touches, final assessments, final refinements, if you will, before it would go to the National Security Advisor and ultimately to the President of Afghanistan.
So 1 year has passed since the very infamous or famous Doha Agreement took place between the United States and the Taliban or the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan. So since in the last 365 days, plus 365 days, how do you think how far both the parties have come in this whole 1 year? What is the implications on the ground?
Well, I think it's clear that the United States has more or less lived up to its promises in that agreement. But on the other hand, the Taliban have continued to violate their promises in the agreement. 2 of the most important promises that the Taliban had made in that agreement with the United States was, number 1, to decrease the level of violence. Now, they have not been attacking American or coalition forces since the signing of the agreement, but they have continued, in fact, heightened the levels of violence against the Afghan national security forces and against the Afghan people. You could see that over the past year in both urban terrorist tactics, everything from bombings to suicide attacks to complex attacks. And most recently, the most prevalent tactic they've been using is these magnetic bombs. And literally, they've been using that against pretty much everyone, people in the media, civilian population, government officials, NGO workers, literally everyone. So the levels of urban terrorism has not only not decreased, but in fact, over the past year, have increased substantially. At the same time, the Taliban have also been increasing attacks in the countryside, insurgent-type tactic attacks in the countryside against district centers, against government facilities, and against Afghanistan national security forces. So the fact that they promised to decrease levels of violence has actually gone completely the opposite. The second major promise they had made with the United States in that agreement was to cut all ties with non-Afghan terrorist groups that operate in Afghanistan and in the region. And clearly that also has not been the case. For all intents and purposes, reports that are coming out, most recently the United Nations report that came out clearly shows that the Taliban have completely maintained ties with the non-Afghan terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda and other groups. So if you see, the Taliban has not, in fact, lived up to the promises they've made in the agreement. The United States, more or less, has lived up to its promises, with certain exceptions. When the Taliban have been attacking Afghan national security forces, the United States, on a few occasions that I know of, has provided close air support. So the deal from the Taliban side has been completely violated. As to what the implications are on that, I think it is to be seen. As you know, the new United States administration is still in the process of reviewing that agreement and how the Taliban have viewed the agreement and have implemented that. We will see once that review is done by the Biden administration and see what they have to say about the agreement and its future status.
Okay. Despite the ongoing intra-Afghan talks, we have seen that Taliban has increased its military campaign, especially by targeting security personnel and closing down on important districts, mostly in eastern and southern Afghanistan. What does it say about the Taliban nature and why such military offensives have been successful?
Well, as you know, the Taliban is an insurgent group, and the nature of insurgency really relies on the continuation of violence. If an insurgent group ceases violence, then it actually has absolutely no other leverage over the government. So the mere fact that the Taliban continues as an insurgent group shows that it has to continue levels of violence. Through violence, the Taliban has been able to maintain pressure on the Afghan government. It's been able to maintain pressure on the international coalition. And in my view, they will continue to do so until a grand agreement is made, and that agreement, if and when it is signed, and if and when it comes up, would ultimately lead to the Taliban getting transformed from an insurgent group into a political group. So for as long as the Taliban continues to be an insurgent group, I think levels of violence, to some extent, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, will continue.
That's right. So while Taliban has continued to intensify its military strategy and military campaign against even civilian populations, also have been targeted in many places. Sir, Biden administration's first foreign policy challenge lies in Afghanistan. So what are your expectations from the new administration as far the war in Afghanistan is concerned? Because the previous administration of Donald Trump had a very different view of the of the participation in Afghanistan, of the US participation in Afghanistan. And Joe Biden's policy seems to be a bit different. So, what is your personal take on on the expectations from the Biden administration in the coming days?
Yeah. Well, first, I completely understand the stand the United States is taking. I understand the position the United States is right now in having hesitation in continuing this open-ended support to Afghanistan. I mean, let's take it. It's been almost 2 decades. It's the longest war in the United States history. And so to continue financial and military and political support in an open-ended way, that may not be that's completely understandable that the United States has hesitations. In fact, I just returned to the U.S. after about 4.5 months in Afghanistan, and from what I can see, what I can observe from the outside, it actually very visible that this sense of isolationism in the United States government, both on the left side and on the right side, is pretty much visible. Given the alterations, given the changing environment in the world, especially after this over a year of the COVID pandemic, the United States is facing a lot of challenges. So that those challenges are also affecting the sense of isolationism, and that sense of isolationism directly affects how the Biden administration views Afghanistan. And as an Afghan, as an American, I completely understand their hesitation in continuing the open-ended support. But I do hope personally that the Biden administration takes a more sober view of analyzing the situation in Afghanistan than that the Trump administration. What could see from the Trump administration, a lot of it was driven by emotional impulse rather than sober strategic thinking. I am positive that the Biden administration, with the personalities they have within the national security and foreign relations apparatus in Washington, they are taking a more rational view and a more sober analysis of the situation. And if one were to do that, if one were to do that sober analysis, and even strictly thinking from the American national interest perspective, forget about Afghanistan, forget about the region specifically and strictly, and this is, the worst case scenario. To think from a U.S. national interest perspective, it still makes sense for the United States to continue some level of support in Afghanistan for the longer term. What do I mean by that some level of support? I mean a very limited, probably a very limited physical presence there in terms of military, specifically to be focused on counterterrorism. Because let's take it, even if in the best case scenario of the Afghan government reaching an agreement, a political agreement with the Taliban, terrorism is not going to end in this country. There are a lot of other groups that require to be contained for the longer term. So a limited U.S. military, specifically counterterrorism presence in Afghanistan is in the national interest of the United States and obviously of the region. Coupled with that is, again, limited financial support to the Afghan national security forces. Because let's take it, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces are the first line of defense against terrorism in the region. They are the ones sacrificing their lives. So to continue some level of financial and military support, enough to keep them going, is absolutely necessary for them to continue their counterterrorism operations, and that also is in the national interest of the United States. Again, the Biden administration right now is reviewing their agreement, reviewing the previous U.S.-Taliban agreement. They're reviewing their choices. They're deciding as to what to do next in Afghanistan and the region. But it's my hope that they, again, take a sober analysis and take United States national interest in picture as they go forward.
Yeah. very rightly pointed out that America needs to kind of review the deal once again. Sir, you mentioned about that United States might maintain some amount of limited presence in Afghanistan, which will be only restricted to counterterrorism operations. If I'm not wrong, they will be countering foreign terrorist organizations such as the Al Qaeda, the Islamic State of Khorasan province, etc., and so on and so forth. Sir, if United States maintains a presence in Afghanistan in the coming days, will they also help Afghan National Army? Will they also train the Afghan National Army?
Of course, well, the current NATO mission in Afghanistan is basically threefold. Number one is the train and advise mission, which is basically NATO's resolute support, and the United States part of that. So the train and advise mission hopefully will continue in the longer term. The Afghan National Security Forces certainly require and need that train and advice from their NATO partners. So that's number one. Number two mission that NATO has there is basically the financial sustainment of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And that's also our hope, my hope, that mission also will continue. Obviously, some adjustments and alterations might be necessary here and there, but the overall mission to financially sustain the Afghan National Security Forces is absolutely a necessary cornerstone of any counterterrorism mission in the region and in Afghanistan, and it's my hope that it will continue. And the third mission that NATO currently pursues in Afghanistan is NATO's political mission, which is currently focused on the peace process, on facilitating the peace process between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. That obviously will continue until a political settlement will be reached. So overall, the current threefold mission that NATO has, it is my hope that will actually continue until we get more clarity on the ground as to what happens with the peace process and beyond.
So we have seen the first Vice President, Amrullah Saleh, has mentioned that Biden administration has increased consultation with the Afghans, whether it's the civil society, the security, or the government officials over the last few months, which has been very opposite to the February 2020 deal, something which the previous Trump administration did not adhere to. So reviewing the US-Taliban deal, is it the right thing to do? Because Afghanistan people were not been involved in the deal in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a good sign to hear that the new United States administration is increasing consultations with the Afghan government and with the Afghan people on the various aspects of this conflict, especially when it comes to the peace process. I mean, ultimately, if it is war or if it's peace, it affects Afghanistan more than any other country in the region and in the world. So it's the Afghans that are at the forefront of the violence, that they are at the forefront of the war. And if peace is going to be achieved, the terms of that peace will directly affect Afghans more than anybody else. To start with, 2 years ago or more, when the United States started negotiating directly with the Taliban, in fact, that was not the right thing to do, to separate the US Taliban agreement and the Afghan government Taliban agreement. These two are two sides of the same coin. So to begin with the Trump administration, it really was not the right thing to do, to have a separate deal with the United States and then have a separate deal with the Taliban. In fact, both of those should have gone hand in hand. Negotiations for both of those should have been the same from the beginning. The Afghan government should have been directly involved in those negotiations. So to separate it in the beginning was not the right thing to do. Now that the Biden administration is here, and of course the deal, I mean, the agreement has been signed over a year ago. Now you cannot completely undo that document, although it is to be seen as to what the Biden administration is going to decide upon the fate of that deal. But it's a very good sign to hear that the United States government right now is directly consulting with the Afghan government, with the officials in the government. In fact, I also hear that they're not only consulting with the Afghan government, but they're also consulting with the major political figures that are outside of the government, that are not directly involved in the government. So that consultation is also necessary. Consultation with the government, consultation with the political figures, and ultimately through them, consultation with the Afghan people would be a major cornerstone of any successful political deal that is going to be made with the Taliban.
If we have seen over the few incidents that have taken place post the deal, we have seen that the one group, or the only group that has benefited from the deal is the NATO troops, because the attacks on them has minimized or significantly been zero to very few, while the attacks on Afghan forces have significantly increased. And the number of American troops is the lowest in the last 2 decades at the moment. So what message does the Taliban have for Afghanistan government through these repeated attacks? One, and is it that through this deal, the NATO forces are just trying, the American government is just trying to save the NATO troops from the attack and just going away from the war?
Well, I hope that is not the case. I hope that that any negotiations that are happening between the United States and the Taliban, between our NATO partners and the Taliban, are not just for NATO and for the United States to close a deal in order to pave the way for their own withdrawal. I hope that is not the case. It doesn't seem that that is the case. To me, it looks like the United States is genuinely involved in the peace process, that they are negotiating, that they are really trying to get not only the Taliban to the negotiating table, they're trying to get the countries that have influence over the Taliban also on board. They're also trying to get the region on board. So from the angle that I see, the United States is really genuinely involved in this, and they are really trying to get to a close of the war such that the peace in Afghanistan and in the region would be sustainable. On the issue of the continuation of violence, and I mean, I was talking about it earlier. The nature of an insurgent group is to continue the levels of violence, sometimes lower, sometimes higher. It's basically violence that makes an insurgent group exist. If they cease violence, they actually will cease to exist. Now, specifically with the Taliban, if you remember a few years back, we had 2 years in a row for the Eid holidays, 3 days of Eid holidays for 2 years in a row. We had mutual ceasefire between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And for all of the reports that I got in the aftermath of those, the Taliban immediately in the aftermath of those ceasefires were facing quite a lot of challenges in terms of regrouping their forces, in terms of remotivating their forces, and in terms of giving that really skewed worldview to their forces again. I mean, let's face it. Operational issues aside, because I mean, once you stop operations on the planning and conducting of violence, it's really difficult to restart it again. I mean, it's like an old machine that once it's shut off, to restart it, it takes quite a lot of effort. Even that issue aside, now the Taliban are motivating their fighters to come and engage in some of the, bloodiest terrorist activities that they've been conducting against the Afghan security forces and against the Afghan people. They've been motivating them by giving them a completely skewed and wrong view of the situation. They keep telling that people who work in the Afghan government are all infidels, that nobody prays, that nobody goes to the mosque, and that there are no mosques in the government-controlled areas. I mean, they give them all kinds of, they feed them with those lies in order to motivate them and get them to come to violence. Now, you cease violence, you stop fighting, then the fighters come into the cities. They come into the towns, they come into the villages, they get into contact with normal people to see that everything that their leadership have been telling them were actually lies. There's been many cases, numerous cases of Taliban fighters coming into contact with ordinary people and really questioning the beliefs that they've been fed for years while fighting for the Taliban. So for that reason, the Taliban are, in my view, they're never going to stop levels of violence at all until a grand agreement is reached between them and the Afghan government, such that they would then really strategically decide to transform their movement from an insurgent group into a political group. So levels of violence are actually intentional. They're intentional, one, for this purpose, in order to get the fighting machine, the insurgency machine running. And number two, the increased levels of violence over the past few years, also a few months specifically, signals that the Taliban strategically are trying to put more pressure on the Afghan government. They're trying to put more pressure on the coalition forces through attacking the Afghan national security forces and the Afghan people to basically tell them, look, if you don't reach an agreement with us on the terms that we want, we are capable of continuing this bloody war for as long as it takes. So for all intents and purposes, in my view, the continuation of violence and the heightened levels of violence by the Taliban has been absolutely intentional, it's been calculated, and it's been strategic.
So keeping that in mind, that the violence is already at the highest level as we speak, and the Taliban is continuing with trying to gain strategic depth through violence, while the political negotiations are also going in the back channel, sir. One quick thing I wanted to mention was the recent NATO defense minister meet that happened last month on 18th of February. So Secretary General Stoltenberg maintains that the NATO will withdraw at the right time and not hastily, which is in line with the statement made by the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. So contemporary to this, parallel to this, the Taliban deputy Mullah Brother in an open letter has strongly pointed out that the group stand that US should abide by the Doha Accords, and any alteration is not a good option, given that the Taliban has already intensified their military violence and increased it in the past so many months. How do you see this open declaration of Taliban while the NATO wants to stay in Afghanistan and not withdraw hastily?
Well, obviously, I mean, as we talked about, the Taliban have clearly violated the terms of that agreement they had made with the United States. We talked about how they did not only not decrease levels of violence, but have also increased that both in the urban terrorist setting as well as the countryside insurgency attacks. At the same time, they've also not cut ties with foreign terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, has been documented by various reports, most notably the United Nations report. Now, if the Taliban have not abided by their own terms within that agreement, how could they expect the United States to abide by it? Especially given that it's a different administration that came into it. Now, if the Taliban had been cooperating and if the Taliban had been abiding by their promises in the agreement, now they probably would have had a more logical perspective, a more logical sound when they call upon the United States to not alter any terms within that agreement. They have not abided by it. Why would they and how would they expect the United States to abide by it? Number one. And number two, the ground reality is that the Taliban signed that agreement with the Trump administration, and now they have to deal with the Biden administration. There's an entire new group of people in Washington in power making new decisions. So, like it or not, they have to deal with the Biden administration now. It's not for the Taliban to get to have what the United States does. It's on the United States to decide what to do, and the Taliban have no choice but to deal with that.
So you mentioned one of the clauses of the Doha deal was to break ties with foreign terrorist groups, mainly the Al-Qaeda. Reports of UN monitor groups and killing of Al-Qaeda leaders in Taliban strongholds suggest otherwise. So what is your take on the Taliban still harboring for foreign fighter terrorist groups?
Look, it's not just Al-Qaeda that the Taliban have a symbiotic relationship with. they estimated sometimes between 19 to 21 terrorist groups of all stripes that operate in Afghanistan that the Taliban have had a symbiotic relationship with. In fact, I've often talked about three symbiotic relationships when it comes to terrorism in Afghanistan and the region. The number one symbiotic relationship is basically the inter-terrorist group symbiotic relationship. And in that, intelligence estimates have shown that sometimes 18, sometimes 19, even to 21 terrorist groups coming into four different categories operate in Afghanistan. I've often talked about this. We've got the Afghan category 1, the Afghan Taliban. We've got the category 2, which is the Pakistani groups, some 10 to 12 Pakistani groups, everything from the TTP to Lashkar-e-Taiba to Jaish-e-Mohammed to what have you, currently exist and operate in Afghanistan, and almost all of them have a tight symbiotic relationship with the Afghan Taliban. In the third category, you've got the regional terrorist groups. Four of them I've always talked about. You've got the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is the Chinese, ETIM, the Chinese Uyghurs. You've got the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which is Uzbeks. Then you've got two Tajikistani terrorist groups in the region operating in Afghanistan, which is Jundullah, Jamaat Ansarullah, and Jundullah of Tajikistan. And then finally, you've got the globally oriented terrorist groups, which is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Khorasan province. So the Taliban have had symbiotic relationships with literally every one of these terrorist groups. And that symbiotic relationship has been essential both to the survival and operation of the Taliban, as these groups provide the Taliban with funds, they provide them with new tactics, they provide them with certain weaponry, they provide them with certain equipment given their reach across the region. And in turn, the Taliban has also been providing, first of all, the Taliban has been providing the ungoverned or undergoverned territories in which terrorist groups foster. The first essential ingredient for any type of terrorist group to exist and operate, that's what the Taliban have been providing to these other groups. They've also been providing them with local know-how, with cultural understanding, with language capabilities, etc., etc. So that symbiosis has been essential both for the existence and operation of the Taliban, and it's been essential for the existence and operation of these other groups. Now, the second symbiotic relationship that I've often talked about is the tight symbiotic relationship between transnational terrorism and transnational organized crime. Organized crime, you've got all kinds of organized crime really operating in Afghanistan, happening in Afghanistan, that feeds violence and is actually getting fed by violence. The largest of that is obviously drug. I don't need to go through the details of that, but you all know that that the drug cartels in Afghanistan, the transnational organized criminal groups in Afghanistan, more or less provide about 90% of opium-related drugs in the world. I mean, this is a huge, huge industry that exists. But apart from drugs, you've got all kinds of other organized criminal activity, everything from gun running to kidnapping for ransom, to human trafficking, to human smuggling, to flora crimes, to fauna crimes, to all kinds of organized transnational criminal activity that we could go into detail at some other point if you wanted. So this symbiotic relationship between transnational terrorism and transnational organized crime, again, feeds violence and again gets fed by violence, and that exists. And the Taliban have not cut ties with those either with those activities or with those groups. And finally, the third symbiotic relationship, obviously, is the state sponsorship of terrorism in the region. And again, I don't need to need any country. It's too obvious that there are certain states that have been using terrorism as a proxy war, as a tool of furthering their foreign policy. Now, on any of these three symbiotic relationships over the past year since the Taliban have signed that agreement with the United States, they've not backed off. Those relationships exist. Those relationships perhaps will exist until, again, a grand agreement, until and unless that grand agreement, political agreement, is made between the Afghan government and with the Taliban.
Well, that was a very wholesome breakdown of the categories and the symbiotic relationship that the Taliban holds with a lot of other groups and the criminal activities that it is involved in. Sir, moving ahead, the Afghan National Security Advisor, Mr. Hamdullah Mohib, pointed out that the Afghan National Security Forces is capable enough against all odds if the intra-Afghan negotiations fail. So according to your assessment, how well prepared the ANSF and the Afghan National Police is to counter the potential challenges in future, given that the attacks and a targeting of civilians, mostly the people in the civil society, representatives of the civil society and the women as well, are being targeted. So how are these challenges going to be faced and countered by the ANSF or the ANP, and how strong and well prepared are these two institutions?
Well, as to the specific military preparedness of the ANDSF, I cannot directly comment on that because I don't work in the security sector right now, and I don't have the latest as to as to how prepared they are. But I can tell you one thing from my experience, not only that I am an Afghan, but also from my experience in the Afghan security apparatus, national security apparatus, is that we've got probably some of the best soldiers in the world. This is not something that I say as an Afghan. We've been told that by American generals, we've been told that by NATO generals, and by our partners across the region and the world who have had experience serving alongside the Afghan security forces. We've got some of the toughest, some of the bravest, some of the most resilient forces, perhaps, that are existent in the world. The time that I was serving in the National Security Council, there were actually times that for days and days and even months, the rate of casualties within our national defense and security forces were over 100 per day. And to view that from a population of probably 30 to 30 million Afghans overall, that's a pretty high rate of casualties. Yet we never, in my 4.5 years of service in the National Security Council, I never saw any instance of us lacking or seeing challenges in terms of recruitment in the army and in the police. There always were and are rows and rows and rows and rows of young Afghans ready to come and join the security forces and continue the fight. Now, we don't lack in bravery, we don't lack in resilience, we don't lack Afghan national security forces. I mean, don't lack in the intent to fight against terrorism in Afghanistan and on behalf of the world in the region. What we do lack, what the Afghan national security forces do lack and require assistance with, is they lack in weapons, they lack in equipment, they lack in financial support. I think the NSA is absolutely right in saying that that the Afghan National Security Forces are prepared and are ready to continue the fight for as long as it takes if peace negotiations don't work. I might add to that it's absolutely necessary for our regional and global partners to continue that support. Now, the preparation from a personal perspective, from a human perspective, the willingness to sacrifice their lives and blood, that the ANDSF has. What they need from our partners is in finance and in equipment and in weapons. And I think for as long as that support continues to be provided, I don't think the Afghan National Security Forces will back off from the fight.
Recently, we have seen yet another leaked document related to the Afghan peace agreement from the Biden administration, which highlighted 3 key elements: building principles for a new constitution and a new state structure, terms for a transnational government involving the Taliban, and terms for a permanent ceasefire. 2 of the main important things, if you look at, one is about the constitution. How do you see this going forward, especially some key elements like democracy and individual rights? Will it be given priority? especially over the last few months, we have seen a lot of discussions in United Nations as well, and one of those discussions probably highlighted about how the past 18 years of what Afghanistan has gained from after the Taliban regime was mostly about rights for women, and that should not be compromised. How do you see this going forward? And secondly, of interim government that being formed with the Taliban, how do you see this implementation?
Well, everything, every time I personally think about this issue of security versus the liberal democratic gains we have had over the past 2 decades, I'm always reminded of a saying, and again, I'm not too sure if it really did happen, but that's not important. What is important is the message that actually the saying says. It says, at some point during World War II, the Secretary for Finance in the British government went to Winston Churchill and said that, look, sir, we are under a lot of restraints on finances. The war is continuing. We need a lot of funds for all kinds of military operations. So we cannot budget funds for the maintenance of national galleries and arts galleries and all of that. And then apparently Mr. Churchill said, then why are we fighting the war? What are we fighting the war for? What that message says is that wars are always fought for certain values. And if those certain values are not present or are not protected, then why are we in fact fighting the war? Forget about the past 42 years of violence in Afghanistan. Over the past 2 decades, we've been fighting with the Taliban over some values. I mean, the main difference between the Afghan government and the Taliban, the main difference between the majority of the Afghan people and the Taliban revolve around these liberal democratic values. We don't have any problems in terms of, such as, this is not an ethnic war. This is not a war of religion. This is not a war over territory. This is really a war. It's been a war over values. And now, after 2 decades of fighting and bloodshed and spending billions and billions and billions of dollars of American money and of European money and of Afghan money, what does it say if we completely forget about all those values and say, okay, well, we're just going to make peace with any price that it might have? I don't think that's what the Afghan government is prepared to do. I don't think that's what the Afghan nation as a whole is prepared to do. So the main values, the main liberal democratic values that we have acquired and maintained so costly for over 2 decades would need to be preserved within any peace deal that might come. Now, having said that, it is also not realistic to expect that the Taliban would completely come to terms and agree with pretty much everything that exists and would say, okay, yes, we were wrong for fighting for 2 decades. We're just going to lay our arms and come and join the government. I don't think, we all know that they're not going to do that. So some level of compromise needs to be reached between the Afghan government and Afghan people on the one side and the Taliban movement on the other side. The leaked document that you mentioned also specifies that, and again, I mean, this is a proposal. It's not a deal. It's not a signed a document between anyone. This is merely a proposal that currently is getting reviewed by the Afghan government and Afghan political circles. And my understanding is in fact, from what I know, is that the Afghan government will come up with a counter proposal to the United States and to the Taliban. And what will be in that counter proposal, I don't know. But again, even this leaked document says that the current constitution will be the starting point for drafting a new constitution. Now, obviously, certain things will need to change in the constitution to accommodate some of the main demands that the Taliban have. Perhaps they also have some legitimate demands that need to be incorporated into the constitution, into the new laws, and into the new state structure within the government in the future. But overall, some of the main values that we have acquired and we have preserved costly over the past 2 decades would need to be preserved. At least that's my hope.
But does this compromise worries you to some extent?
Well, I mean, it needs to be seen. Negotiations would need to happen, and negotiations will happen, perhaps for weeks, perhaps even for months, or even longer, over the terms of of that compromise. It is difficult for anyone to really imagine what compromises would the Afghan government make, what compromises would the Taliban make. But for as long as there is will for peace on the both sides, and I think there is will on the both sides. I mean, the Afghan government has always been open. The Afghan people have always been open to peace with the Taliban, obviously under certain circumstances. And if you look at the Taliban also, I mean, they have also been fighting for 2 decades. 2 decades of war is not easy to do. I mean, I talked about the casualties on the Afghan government side. Trust me, the Taliban have a lot higher casualty rates. They had, and I'm pretty sure they have to continue to suffer large numbers of casualties, to continue to live in an outside country, to continue to kill your own countrymen, to continue to get killed by your own countrymen. It's not easy. So I'm pretty sure that the Taliban also overall have a will for peace. Now, for as long as there is overall will on the both sides for peace, it is my hope that the two sides could come to a rational, sustainable compromise on each side, something that would preserve the major democratic liberal values that we have acquired, some of the major values that the majority of the Afghan people will deserve to have and would like to have and will continue to fight for. And at the same time, to take into account some of the legitimate wants, some of the legitimate objectives that the Taliban also have to be incorporated into the new country, if you will.
Yep. So this is a little bit about an internal challenge that Afghanistan faces at the moment. Is about the issue of corruption that we have seen, and we have recently seen in the last Afghanistan conference, the pledging that happened. We have seen conditional funding that has happened with more imposed conditionality just because of the nature of corruption that has taken place. And we've also seen recently a formation of an anti-corruption commission that happened in November, just before the conference, though it met with criticism. But in a long-term solution of if an interim government forms, how will the issue of corruption be tackled with?
I mean, as you very rightly said, corruption has been a major challenge for us in Afghanistan. I mean, corruption exists in every country, fine, but the levels of corruption that is happening in Afghanistan is very, very high, and they all obviously have root causes. Violence, the continuation of violence itself is a major cause of corruption because, I mean, not only a major part of the budget, the Afghan government budget, the national budget, and the budget that our strategic partners, particularly the United States and NATO, are providing, it actually all goes into the war. The attention of the government goes all into the war. So war and violence create the situation and the conditions for the prevalence of corruption. That's one thing. Organized crime, I talked about. Large-scale transnational organized crime really breeds corruption. It breeds corruption and again gets directly affected by corruption at all. So the corruption levels that exist in Afghanistan, they all have root causes. a main part of that is violence. Now, if you go into the scenario of an interim government or government of peace or a transitional government, or whatever you want to call it, and I'm not talking about the timing of that as to when that is going to come. We don't know. We don't know first if it is going to come, and we don't know when it is going to come. But if it does come, that would mean, if not the end of violence, but a substantial reduction in. With that substantial reduction in violence and substantial reduction in the prevalence of transnational organized crime, obviously the levels of corruption will decrease automatically. Because why? Because the conditions for corruption that earlier are being fed by violence and by transnational organized crime, large-scale transnational organized crime. So you take them away, or you at least substantially decrease that, obviously room for corruption will tighten. But again, it's not going to be a silver bullet. It requires strategic action by the Afghan government. It requires a strong political will by the political leadership within, not only within the government, but across the country to fight against corruption. It's not easy, but it's doable. And it's my hope that as we go forward, not only currently the efforts that the Afghan government is putting on curbing corruption would work, would reduce it, but also if we go towards a new government, that new government will put in place mechanisms for.
One can sense a lot of hope in whatever you have described so far, as far the corruption part goes. And you mentioned about the third symbiotic relationship that you mentioned was state-sponsored terrorism. And me being an Indian, you being an Afghan, I'm sure we all are obsessed with one thing that is common between us is Pakistan. So Pakistan doesn't want USA to review the deal. And so what are the self-interests that Pakistan has embedded in Afghanistan, given that the Islamabad-Rawalpindi nexus have been essential in bringing the Taliban to the table? So what is the role of Taliban in the whole scenario, and how do you see the as a building a regional consensus, how Pakistan will be an essential player in Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's no secret that Pakistan has been involved in Afghan affairs for a long time. And what that involvement means is that Pakistan has used proxies to fight against the Afghan government for a very long time. Most of the people in the West, I live in the United States, and even after 20 years of the United States involvement in Afghanistan, still a lot of Americans think that Pakistan, even those Americans who are more or less, knowledgeable about the Afghan affairs and the regional affairs in that part of the world, still think that the Pakistani interference into Afghan internal affairs started in 1979 with the Soviet invasion. That is an absolutely false perspective. That's an absolutely false notion to have. I mean, Pakistan goes way back. Their attempt to meddle in Afghan affairs goes back to 1947. And the first real practical instance of what we see Pakistani military, of course, proxy involvement in Afghanistan goes back to 1973. The coup d'etat attempt against President Daoud Khan. And then they attempted again in 1975. This is several years before the communist revolution in Afghanistan, and of course before the Soviet invasion. So Pakistan has always seen Afghanistan as a threat, and I think from what I can gather, there are two main reasons for that. At the strategic level, two main reasons as to why Pakistan sees Afghanistan as a threat from its backyard and has always been trying to destabilize it. Number one, obviously, is the territorial dispute that Afghanistan has with Pakistan. I mean, this issue of Durand Line, it goes back to 1893 of the Durand Agreement. That dispute has never been settled. That dispute has roots in Afghan history. It has roots in Pakistani history. It has roots in Afghan culture. In fact, it has roots in the political culture, both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So for as long as that even implicit dispute continues, I don't think that Pakistan would strategically feel comfortable with Afghanistan. That's number one. And number two is obviously this issue of India. Again, this issue of Kashmir and the territorial dispute between Pakistan and India, and the close cultural and political ties going back again to 1947 between India and Afghanistan makes Pakistan uncomfortable. In fact, I've seen the Pakistanis specifically spell these two issues out time and again in official meetings. So that environment, those two strategic large issues are sort of at the backbone of why Pakistan meddles into Afghan affairs. I've also heard other arguments, a third argument. Some people think that even if you resolve the dual mind issue, and even if you resolve this India-Pakistan issue on Afghanistan, let's say Afghanistan and India just decide to, for the sake of Pakistan, say, okay, well, we're going to postpone or cut our relations. Still, some people argue, and I think there's a good amount of logic into that Pakistan will not cease meddling into Afghan affairs. Why? And even Indian affairs. Because they say, look at the state structure in Pakistan. I mean, they have over 1.5 million security forces. And that security forces consumes or even owns, from what I hear, more than 45% of the Pakistani GDP. Now, people in the security apparatus there basically have it all in Pakistan. I've been to Pakistan. They enjoy great lives. They enjoy pretty much unrestrained political power. Every time the army doesn't like the civilian leadership, they overthrow them. And the only reason and the only way the security military establishment in Pakistan can sustain and continue that unrestrained, unrestricted power is to basically create this huge existential threat from India that is to some extent also supported by Afghanistan from the back. So some people make this argument that even if you take out, when it comes to Afghanistan, even if you take out this issue of Durand Line and issue of India, still the Pakistanis would meddle because they have to, because the security establishment would have to come with an excuse to maintain that large army to basically consume that 45 or more % of the GDP. Now, whatever the reason, either the territorial dispute, the India dispute, or this notion that I just talked about, the strategic environment continues to be the same for Pakistan. It has not changed. Some people think that Pakistan will suddenly change course and will come and cooperate with Afghanistan by bringing the Taliban to the table. I am not too optimistic about that, unfortunately, because what makes them do that? If they suddenly were to change their mind, there has to be a reason as to why they would change their mind. And that reason, I don't see any of the reasons that would lead to a complete change of thinking in the security military establishment in Islamabad and Rawalpindi that would change course in Afghanistan. Again, if the United States and NATO and other strategic partners can come into some kind of an agreement that would change the strategic environment for Pakistan, that might be reason to believe it would change. I'm sorry for going into this long answer to Pakistan. It's not a matter of emotion. Some of my countrymen are very emotional when it comes to Pakistan and all of that. To me, it's not an issue of emotion. It's absolutely rational calculation, and I can see where they are coming from. And unfortunately, when I see where they're coming from, I become pessimistic about them changing their mindset.
Right. There is no doubt about a single thing that you mentioned, especially when you pointed out that how the security apparatus is controlling a large proportion of the economy and running the country. And everyone knows there is no hidden secret that who calls the shots in Pakistan. It's not the political apparatus; it's definitely the security apparatus. I think Ratnadeep has a quick follow-up on that question, on that part. I think.
Yeah. So since we're talking about Pakistan, and let's talk about the Haqqani networks for a while. We have seen how India has helped Afghanistan with multiple development projects. Where the other hand, we see Pakistan with state-sponsored the ISI and the link with Al Qaeda. How the Haqqani networks has been targeting Indian infrastructure. Especially, we have seen the attacks in the Sikh Gurudwara last year around March, with the ISIS that has been linked. Now we see a new strategic document by US that say that with the Al Qaeda, the Haqqani network has formed a new unit. How do you see? What's your assessment of this entire situation, and how do you see this deal that has US has struck with the Taliban? How the finances part comes? Do they still finance a certain part of it? Do they still maintain relations with the Taliban?
Well, first of all, I don't have any specific information to point out to right now. I think this would be more of a question for government officials who have access to information. I don't have specific information, but I make assessments based on the information in the past and based on what we hear. So specifically to your question, again, I don't know if such a deal has been made between the Haqqani network and Al Qaeda. I really don't know. But if it did happen, I would not be surprised. Earlier in this talk, we spoke about the various terrorist groups that operate in Afghanistan. I mean, they operate in Afghanistan for a reason. I mean, they operate there because many of them have objectives beyond Afghanistan. Most of them, in fact, have objectives across the region, even across the world. And why they are in Afghanistan? Because the ungoverned or undergoverned territories that have been produced, that have been created by the Taliban, actually creates the breathing and the living environment for them to operate. Now, for as long as that environment exists, terrorism will continue in one way or another. Outlets may change. Today it's the Taliban, the next day it might be the Haqqani network, the next day it might be ISK or some complete new group. But for as long as the environment for the survival and operation of terrorism exists and objectives for that exist, terrorism will continue. Now, this issue of the Haqqani network, and again, as an analyst, obviously the Haqqani network, we always view the Haqqani network as part of the Taliban. In fact, they are part of the Taliban. If you see at the overall Taliban structure, you've got the Quetta Shura at the center, which is in Quetta, Pakistan. Then you've got the Peshawar. You've got the Miram Shah Military Commission. You've got the Mashhad and Zaidan, apparently Shuras or military commissions that also exist across the border to the west. Now, the Miram Shah Military Commission has specifically been dominated by the Haqqani network. In fact, that is the Haqqani network. So while Sirajuddin Haqqani is the head of the Miram Shah Military Commission, at the same time, he is also a deputy to the Quetta Shura. So it is, the Haqqani network is kind of interesting to look at from an analytic perspective. On the one hand, it's part of the overall Taliban umbrella. At the same time, it has its semi-autonomous existence, and then perhaps semi-autonomous or fully autonomous relations with Pakistan or with other groups. Now, what is going to happen if a peace deal is reached with the Taliban? Is the Haqqani network going to be part of that deal? Is it going to splinter into a completely new group? Is it going to go back into its own fully autonomous identity? Is it going to completely join Al Qaeda or ISK? These are all scenarios that are kind of possible and that are to be seen.
Having said that, the foreign terrorist groups have also taken a very strong hold in Afghanistan, and some previous Taliban fighters have often expressed their disappointment with Taliban and joined hands with the Islamic State Khorasan province or the Vilayat Khorasan. So ISKP has increased its hold in Afghanistan, mainly in the east. Non-stop targeting of civilians, media workers, activists, government officials, in broad daylight in the capital and around is at an all-time high. So, is the Islamic State Vilayat Khorasan being the next big chapter of Afghanistan's war, or is it just for the time being, but not so relevant in the coming days? Because the targeting is endless, the bloodshed is endless, and the worst thing is that the civilians are also being targeted on a daily basis. So, what is your analysis of that?
Mm. It's interesting that you use that phrase, the next chapter. The next chapter.
I heard from you only in one of the sessions.
I wrote an op-ed for The Diplomat a few months ago. In fact, I'm titling that article ISK, the next chapter of terrorism in the region, with a question mark. And the question mark is important to note because we are analysts, we make predictions, we make analysis, but we don't really know what exactly is going to happen. Now, to me, the ISK is a major cause for concern, not only for Afghanistan, but also for the region. I've often talked about the resilience of ISK, the composition of the ISK in terms of the ethnic composition. You talk about resilience. I've always mentioned that. I've always talked about how several thousands of their fighters have been killed in operations since the group's inception in late 2014, early 2015 in that region. Yet the group continues not only to survive, but also thrive. 5 of their top amirs have been killed. Dozens and dozens of their major commanders have been killed or captured, yet the group continues to raise more fighters, raise more commanders, and bring in more amirs. So the group clearly is a very resilient terrorist group that operates in Afghanistan. Now, with the scenario of peace with the Taliban, it is my, again, as an analyst, it's my expectation. In fact, I think that at least some number of the Taliban fighters, if the Taliban agrees with a political deal with the Afghan government, joins the government, lay their arms, get incorporated into the Afghan government, a good number of their perhaps mid-level commanders as well as foot soldiers will go and join ISK. Now, again, various scenarios could be thought of. Maybe there is a splinter group of the Taliban. They go and, the Taliban fighters who would like to continue the fight for various reasons, for reasons of ideology, for reasons of finance, for reasons of personal enmity, that as they cannot lay down their arms. I mean, decades of wars created a lot of enmities between families, between clans, and between villages, and to expect that a person would completely lay their arms and be safe, that is not realistic to do. So certain people, certain Taliban fighters may want to be as part of a terrorist group just in order to protect themselves and their families. For reasons of finance, we talked earlier about this symbiotic relationship between terrorism and organized crime. I mean, it's a millions and millions and millions of dollars. In fact, perhaps billions of dollars of industry in the country and in the region. So certain fighters may just continue to fight for the profit. All kinds of reasons could exist. One scenario is that perhaps the number of Taliban fighters who would like to continue perhaps would splinter and form their own group. Perhaps they would join ISK. But what is certain is that the ISK will attract a good number of the Taliban fighters. And ISK will grow in strength to continue the fight. That is a pessimistic view. The optimistic view is that right now, sure that the Taliban are one of some 20 groups that are fighting against the Afghan government, but they are the biggest, the largest, and the strongest group that is fighting. And they are basically consuming a major part of the government attention, the ANDSF attention, and fighting power. So if we talk about the scenario of peace with the Taliban, then the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces can fully focus on fighting these other groups, particularly ISK. In fact, the residual counterterrorism force that we talked about and we hoped from the United States and NATO part to stay in Afghanistan could completely focus on fighting ISK and Al-Qaeda and other non-Afghan terrorist groups. So, it goes hand in hand. On the one hand, we see that a peace deal with the Taliban will potentially lead to a strengthened ISK. But on the other hand, we also see that that potential peace deal could also lead into a stronger and a more focused counterterrorism effort by Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, as well as our international partners against ISK and similar groups.
All these stats and all these figures and all these descriptions about the current war scenario in Afghanistan and how the life of regular civilian revolves in Afghanistan amid all these terror and fear. Sir, 50%, close to 50% of territories in Afghanistan is either occupied by Taliban or contested. Rest of the 50%, rest of the half of the country is government stronghold, which is again being disputed by a lot of other institutions. And as you go from survey to survey, you will find different answers as per, and the ground realities seem to be a bit blurry. While the life goes on, while these developments keep happening, while the negotiations are happening, while the global consensus is being built up for a pro-peace government in Afghanistan or an interim government in Afghanistan, So what is your personal take on the future of Afghanistan? What is going to be the implication in a long run or in a short-term strategic manner?
I mean, as you very rightly said, there's a lot of moving pieces right now. The peace efforts are ongoing. War is still ongoing. There are regional issues. There are proxy wars. There are all kinds of things. There are strategic relationship with the United States, strategic relationship with NATO, other countries. All these moving pieces are there, and it's very difficult to make any concrete predictions as to what is going to really happen in Afghanistan in the near term or even the longer term. But what is certain to me as an Afghan is that Afghanistan will continue to survive as a country. I mean, it's a country that even if we set aside the 1,000 years of history, I mean, even if you go back to 1747, when the modern history of Afghanistan as a unified nation starts, since then, the country has gone through a lot of upheavals. I mean, there was a lot of internal fightings, then there were all kinds of external invasions. Even since then, we had 3 wars with Britain. We survived those. There was a lot of internal upheavals at that time. Then we had invasions by the Soviet Union. Then we had the American occupation, all of that. I mean, the country has survived through all of this. The Afghan people are very resilient. What is very clear to me, I have absolutely no doubt that the country will remain as a country. It's not going to go away. It was a country before the American occupation. It is going to be a country even after a potential withdrawal. It will remain that. Now, how it will remain and what condition, that is to be seen. It might be poor. It might continue to be poor. It might continue to be war-ravaged. It might continue to be overrun by all kinds of violence, but it will survive. Now, the implications for Afghanistan and for the region as to what specifically is going to come are, I think, important to think about as these moving pieces that we talked about are going ahead. Well, first of all, I don't think the world or the region would like to see Afghanistan going back to become completely the hotbed of transnational terrorism and even global terrorism. 9/11, we can't forget 9/11. I mean, the incidents of 9/11. 9/11 happened at the beginning of the 21st century. And now, 20 years later, we are in a completely different world. We're, in fact, in a very much more dangerous world that we were in 2001. Everything from technology to ideology to globalization, to anything that you look at the world, to even the pandemic that we've been struggling with over the past year or so, has altered the world such that events in one country, in one part of the world, affect things in other parts of the world. Now, so number one, I think it's important that we, and by we I mean all the parties that are involved in Afghanistan, not really lose sight of the fact, the potential that if Afghanistan is left to its own, that it could become a hotbed of international terrorism, global terrorism again, and that could threaten, all countries from the region to Europe to even the United States. So that is number one, that is important. Number two, this issue of drugs and transnational organized crime, there is also, a major cause for concern. I mean, the main consumers of drugs that are produced in Afghanistan are countries in Europe and North America. Now, even at the time where we have a government where there is some level of control, there is still some level of authority, we see this prevalence of transnational organized crime. What would it look like if that even limited level of government control does not exist in the country? You think about the hype that we could actually see into the various types of transnational organized criminal activity that we talked about. Number three, implications for the region and the world, particularly for the region and Europe, is refugees. I mean, even at present, Afghanistan has the second largest waves of refugee after Syria. Now, if you get into a scenario where things will fall apart, where instability comes in, where the country goes into complete full-blown war, war of everyone against everyone, perhaps, you could see huge waves of refugees getting into our neighboring countries and, knocking on the doors of the European countries. And refugees is already a huge crisis in Europe. It is kind of getting there in Northern America as well, but mostly in Europe. And now the potential for that is huge. So what I'm basically trying to say here is that Afghanistan was a poor country. It will remain a poor country. It was, less stable country. It will remain perhaps a less stable country if the peace process doesn't work, and the world just decide to dump the country and forget about it. But there are very clear implications for the region and the world that I think we should not lose sight of.
Perhaps it was a very in-depth and very thoughtful, I must say, and indeed, I'm sure the viewers will get the most out of it. And it was quite an insightful, the last part, especially where you said that life should go on, and Afghanistan as a country should definitely stand and should go on. Yes, Ratnadeep, go ahead.
Yeah, so before I let you go, this is the very last question I have. Since you mentioning that life should go on in Afghanistan, life of Afghanistan should also go on. For a lot of viewers who are watching this, and let's talk, I mean, I know tourism is not one of the agenda that's on the list at the moment, but let's talk about tourism for a bit. Like a lot of people who are watching this and who read the news every day, it's very rare that I don't read or come across a report about an attack in Afghanistan that happens. And talking about the safety, even one of the most safest province, the Bamin province, actually, in November 24th, the attack happened right after 2 decades. So, would you ask people who want to visit Afghanistan, what's your message? Would you suggest people to visit Afghanistan? Would you tell that it's safe out there?
Well, that's a very tough question to really answer. Levels of security in Afghanistan, as you very rightly mentioned, are pretty bad, pretty much everywhere. With the exception of 1 or 2 provinces, you've got relentless violence everywhere. Even for people like me, that are Afghan, we live there, work there, security is a major concern. When I'm there, for instance, I'm constantly on the watch. I'm constantly feeling threatened. I'm constantly worried about my own physical security. Now, I don't want to encourage anyone to go visit Afghanistan as a tourist now. I don't also want to discourage anyone to do so. I think it's a personal choice. It's a personal assessment that one must make. One thing that, however, I would like to mention, I mean, for your viewers, is for a person who grew up in violence. In fact, I was born 1 year after the communist revolution of 1978 and 6 months after the Soviet invasion. So I was born in violence, and in fact, I grew up in violence, except some of the years that I've spent here in the United States. All my life, I've lived in Afghanistan, and I know violence. It is always, as a local, when you live there, it's very different from the perspective of a person who looks at a situation from the outside. Even for my family here, my wife and kids, they're here in the United States, and every time an attack happens there, my wife is concerned, and she calls and texts and all of that. But when you are there, it doesn't feel as bad. I mean, perhaps maybe it's the human ability to adapt and get used to situations. So the definition of the word normal is different when you live in a war zone. Once you're in, attacks happen, but beside the attacks, normal life goes on. I mean, people get killed, people get injured. These things happen on a daily basis, yet normal life goes on. Again, I don't want to encourage, I don't want to discourage anyone. I hope that the future of that country becomes a lot more stable, a lot more secure, because we have great places to visit. We have a beautiful nature. You've been to Afghanistan. If you go to the countryside, we've got some of the most natural scenery. So I hope that we have stability and security in future, and I hope that we have a situation where people who want to visit can actually visit without a lot of concern for their own physical security. Great.
So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and coming on the show. It's an honor to host you and to get to know the insights that are happening around. Probably are not really covered by the media as such, because they have not been based out of there. And since you were just returning from Afghanistan, you gave us a lot of fresh perspective. So thank you so much for that.
Of course. Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Take care.